Bingo.
All
What
right,
up?
Welcome back, guys. How's it going? Justin is back. Derek isn't feeling well today, so we weren't able to do the sour challenge. Apologies, it keeps getting pushed back. I promise we're gonna do it. We've got the stuff for it. We've got everything worked out for it. We're just waiting for scheduling to line up and people to be feeling well and all that. So, unannounced, today's topic is grace. So this is, I really want to say that effectively, I think that grace is kind of the core principle of the entire Bible. I mean, all of it is God exhibiting his grace, and I think the Old Testament is largely him showing his grace, and the New Testament calling us to do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. When I try to explain Old Testament and New Testament to people who have questions or confused about things, I tell them it's almost like a mirror image of each other. But you're looking from I don't even know the term that I'm trying to use here, but it's like you said, it's God showing grace, right? And then it's the New Testament is trying to show us how to extend grace and live with grace in our lives. So they're almost like mirror images of one another. So it's full of it, and I think it is a core principle behind your faith journey overall.
And so we really have to start by asking, what does that mean? Exactly, like what grace is. Because it's, we all know like the words like gracious and graceful, but it's one of those things that I think we understand the kind of the basic idea from context, but we might not necessarily be able to put it into words. Even getting ready to do this video, we're struggling to like, how do we put this into terminology that's going to make sense and is easy to understand. And so what we kind of came up with was that grace is the embodiment of God's unconditional love, mercy, and favor towards humanity. And I really want to focus specifically on favor, because we see again and again in the Bible, it talks about God's chosen people. And in the beginning, that was Jews, and later through Jesus Christ, that was extended to Gentiles, right? Which are people that aren't Jews, which is us in this case. So, but that favor, that's his favor. We still have to define that, like what favor means. Right. But it's effectively like God's unconditional love and his mercy. Really,
I look at it because I have children. I guess I understand it a little more from the God the Father standpoint, because I have to extend so much grace to these two. I do. I had to extend a whole lot of grace before we got going. So I understand it from like the father-son standpoint, that it's unconditional love. It's unconditional forgiveness. It's showing grace and forgiving my child, from that standpoint. Is what God was and is continuing to do for all of us. Grace and forgiveness, grace and redemption, being able to, if you hear the term redemption and you think like there's like this, it is a switch from basically what we call the 180, from this to this, right? You're living a life like this, and then the grace and redeeming power turns you completely around. But it's even redemption in like small moments of like a small failure that now you can be redeemed from, and transformation. Seeing grace transform people extending grace. My children, when they extend grace to each other, there's like it's crazy, but when you think of it, you break it down like that. There's a transformation of their energy that they have. It's when they don't extend grace to each other, they want to kill each other, right? But when they extend grace to each other, it's just it's a quiet, humble home. So I kind of, being a father, I see it, and I kind of understand it from that kind of like point of view there.
And it's interesting because like we have to focus on the fact that I like that transformation. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's also important to emphasize that his love and his mercy and His grace, they are unmerited and they are undeserved, right? And so when you're talking about your interactions with other people, I've mentioned, I think in the past on the channel, my fiance cheating on me, my past, not the woman I ended up marrying.
Not the current.
She's never done any such thing and wouldn't. But I was engaged once before, and she did. And so, did she deserve forgiveness? No. Did she do anything to make amends for that? Anything like that? And the answer is no. Mm-hmm. But what ended up happening was, I never saw her again. But I was holding on to that bitterness, and it was poisoning my heart. And once I forgave her and I showed her that grace, and I hate that I never got to see her in person and let her know that I do care about her, and I genuinely hope she's happy, and I pray for her and her now husband. So maybe it's worked out for them in the long run anyway. And I know I got to marry, an amazing one, and I'm very, very grateful for the way things turned out in the end. Though it was hard to see it in that moment, but the transformation that happened in me when I showed that grace, when I showed that forgiveness that wasn't deserved, it changed who I was completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely transformed the entire rest of my life and set me on an entirely different trajectory. Yeah. And that's really what God's grace is about, is that, we focus on, if we look at like an example of a story like the prodigal son in Luke 15, right? This man has two sons. One of his sons takes his inheritance. He asks for it early. And he goes and blows it on, let's keep it PG and just say partying. And he goes out and he parties hard. He blows it all, and he ends up homeless and destitute. And he thinks, well, even my father's servants live better than this. And so he goes back to his father and he begs his father's forgiveness. And he says, I'm not asking you to take me back into your home. I'll live with the servants. I'll be an employee. Just that life would be better than the life I'm living now. And there's two reactions. There's his brother, who is angry because his father does show him grace and says, go slaughter the fattened, was it calf or lamb?
Calf.
It was the calf. And they throw a big party in his honor because he's come home again. And the brother's upset because he says, I've served you faithfully all these years and you've never done this for me. And it's a stark contrast in showing grace and not. And that he obviously did nothing to deserve the love that his father showed him. But his father loved him anyway and forgave him anyway, because that's what that is.
It is calf. No, go
double checking.
I was like, wait a minute.
I was pretty sure you were right
for a second.
But it's a great example of that, though.
Yeah.
And so if we're looking then at I'll say in my notes, I had like God's chosen that I mentioned right there, our favorite. That's what all of the story of the entire Old Testament is about humanity being undeserving of God's mercy and God's grace. And that's really the whole story of the Old Testament. I tell the kids in our youth group all the time that it's the whole Old Testament is summarized in God makes something great, humanity messes up, God gets angry, God forgives, and the process repeats. And that's the whole new Old Testament. And it's painting in very vivid stories the fact that we don't deserve it, that we're evil. And just go through one day. Just go through one day and think about every time you do something you shouldn't. Whether you looked at someone in a way you shouldn't have, or you thought something about someone you shouldn't have, or you wanted to do something. Even the wanting to do something evil is still a sin. And so just at the end of that day, think about like how much we don't deserve God's grace.
Right. Absolutely.
It's so. How do we receive God's grace? What does that look like?
Oh, well, we do not have to do anything to receive God's grace. God's grace is freely given to us. No special, there's not a checklist. There's no checklist for anything. I'll just tell you, people want checklists. Can I do this?
Well, there's one. There's one requirement.
There's one. But there's not
you get everything with it, though.
Yeah. There's not like a list of things that I have to do. Just like we talk about, there's not a list to get into heaven of checklists. There's no checklist that you have to do to receive God's grace. God's grace is freely given to us. It tells us, make sure I'm in Ephesians, make sure I'm right. Yeah. I lost everything that was. Yeah. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourself. It is a gift from God, not by the works, so that no one can boast. For you are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepares in advance for you. So it tells you in the very beginning, it's by grace that you have been saved through your faith. So anyone can receive God's grace, but through your faith is how you begin to see God's grace be shown in your life. So as you continue to walk with Christ and you continue to dive deeper spiritually and you continue to learn and grow and evolve, and you'll hear me say all the time, and I tell the teenagers all the time, the more that you understand God's character of who God is, through that you start to see the grace that has been given to you by God. The other way that I feel like I'm receiving God's grace is when I extend grace to others.
Absolutely.
So when I can extend the same amount of grace that's been given to me to other people, then I can start to see the grace that God has given me in my life. Kind of like what you were saying when you talk about how, when you say like you were engaged at one point, you harbored a lot of bitterness at that point, and it was a lot of stuff going on in your heart. And then once you were able to forgive that and give grace, you could start seeing the grace that was given around you. This gets a little deeper, but I was sexually molested when I was young, before I was a teenager. And for years, I spent that harbored bitterness in there. And then through Freedom, our Freedom group that we went through, kind of breaking down some walls and breaking down those walls, understanding that the only way that I can get past some of these things is by extending grace, even when I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
You know, like,
especially when you don't want to.
Even when that's the big thing. Is like you're going to feel the weight come off your shoulders more extending grace when you don't want to, and truly extending it, not just I forgive you, it's fine. Because there's a difference between just saying it and truly in your heart having that transformation moment of I forgive you. It doesn't matter. We talked about in our Freedom groups, like, you may have to get on a plane, you may have to take a 5-hour ride to talk to somebody. Maybe you don't. I'm not saying you have to, but maybe you do. I personally never felt the need or the urge to speak one-on-one with that person, but I felt the burden of everything lift off of me when I extended grace in that moment. So that's how I really feel like I receive God's grace, is through those moments. And also it's easier for us because we live by the flesh and we live by our own wants and desires so much. It's easy for us to extend grace to ourselves, but not extend that same amount of grace elsewhere. It's again a conversation that I've had with a lot of the youth over the years is when you spend so much time around people, right? Like I tell the teenagers, like, understand you're going to have to give me grace at some point through this.
Oh, absolutely.
And when you spend so much time around, whether it's spiritual leadership that you feel it is, or people in your life, you start to get an inside look at the fact that they are human. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? And so it's very easy for us as people to see it and be like, see that area right there, and not extend that grace. But we're going to give our grace. We're going to give ourselves the grace that we're not giving them. So for me, I can truly feel like I receive God's grace when I'm extending that out to others. Maybe not my children all the time. Maybe I don't feel God's grace whenever I have to extend it to them. I feel a bunch of other things, but that's fine. We're working on that. We're working through that.
It's important to remember though, is that we're not perfect. And it's a lifelong journey.
It is, and that's the hardest part for. Like I said, it's so easy for people to give themselves. I can give myself as much grace in a situation that I need, like, I can make myself feel better by giving myself grace. But then in the same aspect, see somebody doing or thinking or saying the same thing and be like,
And I catch myself every time.
exactly. I'm hypocritical in this.
And I realize it as soon as I'm done. I was like, do better, be better.
Exactly. 1 Peter 4:10, we had talked about before.
Yep.
It says, for each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. And for that's how you using that scripture there. That's what I mean when I say, when I extend grace to other people, that's when I can see and feel the grace even more that God is giving. Because it's very easy for us to get down on ourselves.
Yeah.
In those moments, we can extend grace to ourselves, but we can also be very harsh on ourselves as well, and not give ourselves enough grace in moments where God's just freely giving it to us. You know, so it's like this balancing act that we're kind of working on.
And I think it's really important. You know, if we look at like love, for example, and people that refuse to acknowledge God, and they say like, well, God's never been loving to me, for example, or they say that God isn't responsible for this because, well, I've never seen it. I think it's interesting because in very much the same avenue, it's difficult to see God's grace, to recognize how much grace he gives you every day until you start giving it and you get that feeling. Because I spoke to my ex, and I told her I'd forgiven her.
Right.
And it was about 2 more years after that before I really forgave her. I was completely content. But I remember when it happened, and until I experienced that, I didn't know what it was exactly until I'd actually gone through it. And I think it's the same way with God's love. It's the same way with God's mercy. It's the same way with God's grace. That until you've actually experienced it for yourself, you being the one that's giving it out, and in its rawest, purest form, it's impossible for you to really see it in your life. And once you've experienced that, once you've seen that, once you've been given the opportunity to exhibit that grace, suddenly you look around your life and you recognize grace everywhere. It's like, oh, I get it now. I see how loving God is in everything, all around me, at all times, every day. I didn't until I had been like 100% purest form of love towards someone else. I was like, you know, it hits you and you're like, man. And so I wish so much that people could experience being more graceful towards others and being more gracious towards others, because they would recognize, it would help them to see more vividly, more obviously, how much grace God extends to them every day.
And it's crazy when you think about, and you know, we're married, so there's a difference between teenagers and being married. But it's crazy when you really take a step back and you look at whether it's personal relationships or professional relationships, whatever you're in, when you take a step back and you look at a person or something that somebody may be going through, you may have a vision in your brain of what it looks like, and it's not, you're not seeing what it is, right? But understanding God's grace, understanding the grace that you're called to give people, right? And I could use my wife and I use my children a lot as examples, right? I have to, just like my wife has to do to me, I have to extend grace to her at times. You know, like, I don't know what the day's been like necessarily.
It goes both ways.
And you know, so like, there's days where like she'll flat out look at me and be like, I need grace today. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, this is just, it's been a day, and I just like, I'm
gonna be kind of a jerk tonight. Bear with me. I'm sorry. I still love
grace. You know what I'm saying? But once you've experienced like that full that feeling of extending it, right? And then you can also recognize when people have given that to you, and in itself, then you truly start to understand what it is.
God, it feels so good.
It does.
It's one of the best feelings in the world.
You know, and then when you can be open about it, that's the other part to it too, is when you can be open about Again, not just in like a, not just like in a personal relationship, in like a marriage or a dating relationship or anything like that. In any relationship, like when you can be open about like going to someone. I've went to our youth pastor on Wednesdays and been like, hey, they're gonna have to give me some grace tonight because I've been in it today, and I don't know where we're heading at the end of this, you know. But you can recognize, and once you can recognize it and be okay with it, then you can start to see it all just come together.
Yeah. But you know, I think it works. This might be vaguely off topic, but I remember it's been. It was around the time I had cancer. I don't remember exactly what had happened, but it was just one of the worst days of my life, and it was on a Wednesday, of course. And like, I've got to go to church tonight, and I've got to work with these kids, and I don't know how to be positive tonight. I don't have it in me. I am beaten down and in the worst mental condition I've ever been in.
Yeah.
And my uncle is a pastor, has been for 50 years. And so I reached out to him that day. I was like, I need some moral support right now. Like, I'm flagging. And he was just like, so what's the issue? Like, what do you mean, what's the issue? I was like, I can't be there for these kids tonight. And he was like, that's the best way to be for them. There for them, though, is to show that you're human too.
Yeah,
that you have bad days too. And show them what someone who's a Christian is supposed to behave like. It's fine for you to cry. It's fine for you to be at the end of your rope. It's fine for you to be beaten down. How do you deal with it?
Yeah.
And he was like, tonight could be the best night of your life, not the worst.
Could be, yeah.
And that contrast is what it's all about. Yeah. It's all about that perspective.
Yeah. We go through,
awesome.
It is, and we go through valleys, and as you continue to grow spiritually, and man, it's funny because it's the same conversation that I've had with a few leadership staff and stuff like that at the church and stuff. Is we go through peaks and valleys in our faith. Like, it's just natural. It's a wave effect. But then you also go through moments where you are so spiritually drained because you've poured out so much that you're in a time where it's like you said, like you're in a time where you're showing up on a Wednesday night, or you're showing up to serve this event, or you're showing up to serve on Sunday in this area, and the whole time that it's leading up to it, or you're on your way there, or you're there in that moment, you're just like, man, you start feeling bad because you're like, man, I'm not in it. Like, I'm not in it tonight. But that's when you understand God's unfailing love and his unfailing grace that he gives you, that's when, like, for me, I'm praying in that moment, like, God, I need you to extend grace for me tonight. Extend grace for me in this season. Yeah. You know, we're gonna get through it. We're gonna figure it out. You know, we're gonna hit some bumps along the road, but we're gonna figure it out. But like, that's when I'm asking you. I know it's given to me, but now, like, I'm conscious enough to understand. And I need that.
And that's exactly how God works, though. Is, you know, you hear again and again, like, God will never put you in something that you can't handle. And like, that's
not true.
Not at all accurate. Not even remotely accurate. It's like, anyone that said that is not. It's not in the Bible.
Yeah.
But God will put you in situations intentionally that you can't handle by yourself, which force you to turn to him, because with him you can do it.
And that so I had this conversation at work the other day, because that is the misconception, is God won't give you any more than you can handle. No, God will give you more. But everybody goes back to David and Goliath, right? And they go back to the small child that is David, with getting ready to slay Goliath there, and they're like, God won't give you any more, like David and Goliath. It's like, no, you're reading it lazy. That's you're reading it literal, and you're reading it lazy. Shout out PR for giving me, if you read the Bible literal
reading is lazy reading.
But in that, it's a conversation I had with him too, because we were talking about it. In that we're not David.
Yeah,
we're not David. If we're in that situation, we're cowered in the back, running with everyone else, right? Because God is that person there. Like, he is the one
And
God is there for that.
that was what I wanted to hit on, was that, I'm driving home and I'm sobbing. I'm literally in tears. I'm like, I was more beaten down than, it was one of the top 5 worst days of my life. And it's interesting. I don't even remember what happened now. It's wild the way that works. But I remember just being at the end of my rope, and I remember the first like half of my drive home, because on Wednesdays I go straight from work to church. I don't have time to stop and change or anything. It's really, I live too far, or I work too far away from the church. And so about half of my drive, I'm just in distress and I'm sobbing. And like, I'm done for the day. And I've got 5 hours left with these kids, And so, and about half my trip was just a wash. And then you hear God's voice. And this, I think that's what we should do for the next video, frankly, is God's voice, hearing God's voice, because it's such a doozy. And we get kids asking about it so frequently. And it's so simple. And I just heard pray.
That's it.
And it's like, I can't believe it didn't occur to me. And I start praying, and Lance is my uncle, and I just heard Lance. And like, why did it not occur to me? That's who I need to speak to. And so I reached out to him, and he gave me the word. And that's how God works. He's nudging you in the right direction. He's helping you to get there. And it could have all been so much easier if I had just prayed sooner.
You spent 30 minutes trying to go through it. So I think that's a good one though. I think that'd be a good one to go through. It's a big one. Understanding it, I don't misinterpret that to be deciphering God's word. No. It's hearing God and what that potentially looks like, and how that could look, because that's a big conversation we have with teenagers a lot. I got it on Wednesday night, was man, I just don't hear God's word. I don't hear God's voice. And it's like, well,
let's learn
how. It's for a different video.
So we'll do that next time. Hearing
let's
how
not
to hear God, how to separate His voice from your own, and how to walk with God according to God's will. So grace, guys.
Extend it to others.
Think about in your life this week, somebody that you have no reason to forgive, except that you're only hurting yourself. So think about who that person is in your life, and start praying for them. Work on extending grace, and I promise your life will turn around for it.
For sure.
Love you guys.
See you.